I'm a Micro Four Thirds shooter and I shot with a full frame camera. Let's talk about it. If you've been watching my videos and you have subscribed to my channel, then you would know that I am a Lumix Micro Four Thirds shooter, and I absolutely love what Lumix did with the Micro Four Thirds system. And I've been using it for probably 7 years now, so it's been a long time. But today, this is a bit of a fun video. It's a little bit different for me, but we're gonna actually be reviewing the new Lumix S5 Mark II camera. This camera is brand new from Lumix. It's been out for a little bit, but it is brand new. It has a lot of advancements. It is a full frame camera. So all I'm gonna do today is kind of share my experience that I had with the S5 full frame. I'm gonna share some benefits of the S5 full frame, and then I'm also going to just show you some comparisons between the size of them, and then I have a fun little activity for you closer to the end. So if you're with me, let's go. So full disclaimer, I'm not getting too technical into the camera just yet. I did just, get it, so I haven't used it too much. So as I use it more, I'll be making more videos on it. But for now, I'm just telling you the main differences that I noticed, the main benefits that I noticed, and there's going to be more things to come as I continue to use it and continue to explore it. So let's talk appearances, because this is kind of a noticeable difference between the two cameras, but I do want to touch base on it just in case you are researching between a Micro Four Thirds and an S5. I want you to be aware. Here we have the S5, okay? You can see how big it is. It is a full frame, so it is technically going to be bigger. And this is the Lumix G Series Micro Four Thirds, okay? So this is the G95. So we can already see that there's a pretty big size comparison with them, okay? The G body is actually smaller than the S5 body, and then the lenses, you can tell that the G lens is actually half the size of what the full frame lens is. So one thing I do want to mention, and I actually mentioned this in my last, maybe my last video, maybe 2 videos ago, I don't know. But I did mention this. If you are looking into buying a Micro Four Thirds camera, then you should know that the focal length of the lens is half of what it would be full frame. So right now I have a 12 to 35 millimeter lens on my Micro Four Thirds. So if we double that, that's 24 to 70. And then on my 14 to 28 millimeter on the full frame, if we half that, it's going to be 7 to 14. So just to be aware, and just to reiterate, the Micro Four Thirds focal length lenses are half of what it would be full frame, hence why it's a smaller lens. In terms of size comparison, the G Series is going to be a little bit lighter just because it is smaller. The full frame is going to be heavier because it is bigger. If you are doing a lot of freehand photography, you might want to consider having a strap on you just so you can kind of give your arm a break. Versus with the G Series, where you can just hold it in your hand all day and you're fine. That was one of the main differences I noticed in between size. This is just a little bit heavier than the G Series, but nothing too noticeable. I mean, when you're photographing and you're shooting, you're not even going to notice it until after. So I wouldn't base your decision on that, but I thought it would be something worth noting just because you might not realize. So let's talk about some of the features with the S5 Mark II. Now I will say, my first impression, I was quite impressed. I honestly felt like I was cheating on my Micro Four Thirds camera just because I'd been using it for so long, and then I used a full frame and I loved it. But that's not to say that I'm gonna switch right from the Micro Four Thirds to the full frame. No. If anything, I'm gonna add it into my camera collection just so I at least have it. And that way I can use it if I do need a full frame or if I do have to venture into something that requires a full frame camera. But I'm gonna kind of get into what I think about it, some of the features. The autofocus on the S5 is a lot better on the G Series. However, I've heard a lot of mixed reviews on the autofocus for the G Series, but I've never had an issue with my autofocus on my G Series. Maybe, I don't know, because I've been using Micro Four Thirds for so long and I kind of figured it out, but I've never had an issue with the autofocus. But I did notice that on the S5, it was just a little bit better than on the Micro Four Thirds G Series. So another little thing on autofocus, if you are really big into autofocus, you'll have your tracking, you'll have full area autofocus, you'll have pinpoint, and then you'll have horizontal and vertical, so zone autofocus. I personally use pinpoint, and then I usually put it on human just because that's mainly what I'm photographing, but it might be different for everybody else. So one thing I do want to mention is that you can switch between human eye and then human/animal focusing. So if you are photographing dogs, you can put it on animal autofocus, and then that way it'll detect that you're photographing an animal. If you are, you want to photograph a human, you can put it on human because that's what you're photographing. If you're trying to, get the camera to follow somebody's eyes, put it on eye detection, because then what happens is that the camera will actually follow the eyes and focus on there versus the human or anything else in the background. So you can kind of play around with different autofocus settings, which is pretty cool. Another big thing for me, I personally love burst shooting. I use it all the time, especially when I'm doing action shots, but I love the burst shooting. But I will say, and this might not be like a popular opinion, or maybe I'm doing something wrong, but I prefer the burst shooting on my Micro Four Thirds than I do on the full frame. I just find on the Micro Four Thirds, the burst shooting is a little bit faster than on the full frame. However, the autofocus on the full frame is better than the autofocus on the Micro Four Thirds when burst shooting. Hopefully that makes sense. If you are doing burst shooting, just keep that in mind. Micro Four Thirds will operate just a little bit faster, but your autofocus is going to be a little bit better on the full frame. So you kind of have to figure out where your priority is. But I will say I've done burst shooting on my Micro Four Thirds and I get super sharp, clear images. On the S5, I do the same thing, just at a different rate. So that's just one thing to know if you are into burst shooting or you do a lot of action shots and you do need to use that burst shooting. I will sometimes use it when I'm in concerts, but like I said, I do find it's a little bit better on my Micro Four Thirds than it is on my full frame. The autofocus for the burst shooting is better on the full frame than it is on the G series. So one thing that I did want to mention, and this is something that you might not have an issue with, but it was an issue for me. So if you are in the same situation as me after I explain this, this is going to help you. It's nothing bad, I promise. But one thing I do notice is that the raw file images are a lot smaller on a Micro Four Thirds than they are on the S5. And that's not a bad thing. And that's totally totally normal because the full frame is like a bigger sensor. So it is going to have a bigger raw image than my Micro Four Thirds. So my Micro Four Thirds, the raw image exports at around 24.4 megabytes, which is a big file, and I do have it on the largest setting, and I am shooting in RAW. Usually I have no issues when I need to export it onto my iPad, my hard drive, or my laptop. Now keep in mind I use an iPad Pro, so it is a bit of a smaller system, and then my laptop doesn't really have a lot of space on it, so I'd have to export everything into my hard drive. But this is where I ran into some issues. My files on the S5 were exporting at around 35 megabytes, which is 10 more megabytes than my Micro Four Thirds. As soon as I saw that number, I knew I was gonna have an issue because I know that my equipment is not, that high tech to open these images. So I had to figure out a way of how I could open these images. So I was able to put them on my hard drive. Perfectly fine. I've got, 2 terabytes of space on there. But I did notice that when I wanted to open it on my iPad, I actually couldn't view the files. So normally my process is, I plug it into my iPad with the SD card and I cull through, and then those ones I put on my hard drive, so I'm saving space. With the S5, I couldn't do that because it actually just wouldn't open the file. It showed that it was there, but it would not open the file. So I was kind of stuck, and I ended up trying to save them into the Photos app. That didn't work as well. So the files were just too big for my iPad. Tried it on my laptop. It was taking a long time to load. I wasn't able to do that, but I did find a workaround for me at least. I was able to open up all of the pictures in Adobe Lightroom. So win for Adobe today, it opened up my S5 images. But the whole point of that story is me just telling you, make sure you have hardware, hard drives, and a pretty powerful computer, a pretty powerful desktop to open such big raw file images, because they will be bigger on a full frame camera, versus a Micro Four Thirds. So I have a fun little activity that I kind of want to do to compare the image quality between a Micro Four Thirds and a full frame. So I'm going to put up a series of pictures here, and I'm not going to reveal the answers just yet, but I kind of want you to pause this video, take a good look at these pictures, and see if you can guess which ones are shot with a full frame and which ones are shot with the Micro Four Thirds. And I didn't do any editing. These are strictly the raws. So put it in the comments below which one you think. Pause the video, we'll be back in a second and I'll reveal the answers. So assuming you pause the video and put down in your answers, I'm gonna reveal the answers right here. And if you got it right, great. If not, don't worry, it's all good. Now, to the naked eye and to an average person, to an average client, they're not gonna know if you used a full frame or a Micro Four Thirds, okay? They look totally the same. I think the image quality on both is absolutely stunning. I think Lumix did a really great job with, you know, building a Micro Four Third camera and keeping the image quality. And then they also did a good job on the full frame and, you know, just really developing that. And personally, I think Lumix has the sharpest pictures in the game. I've never seen raw images come out this sharp before. A key difference, though, that I will say that I think you should be aware of when, you know, you are shooting with either a full frame or a Micro Four Thirds. So to me, because I'm analyzing these photos, I can see that the S5 is just a tiny bit sharper, like the tiniest bit. Because on my Micro Four Thirds, I'm achieving professional results with like half the sensor. So it is possible to be a professional and use a Micro Four Thirds. You don't necessarily need to use a full frame, but the full frame does have a lot of benefits. So a benefit to using a full frame is you don't have to play around with your lighting too much, and you don't have to play around with the camera settings too much. I do find with my G series that sometimes I am, you know, switching a lot between my lights and my aperture and everything, and I am kind of just doing a little bit more work than I would anticipate. But when I use the full frame, I can realistically set it to how I would, or how I would in my head, or how I would on the G series, and, you know, I get the picture I need. So in that sense, there is that difference, and that's the big one I noticed for me, because I work a lot in a studio setting. So for me, lights are really important, and, you know, timing is a big thing. Like I said, I've been using Micro Four Thirds for so long that I kind of just know my camera, but full frame does make it just a little bit easier to control and kind of, you know, have just one setting and, you know, you're good to go. Some people might argue that the colors are better on a full frame sensor than a Micro Four Thirds, and I've gotten that many times. And, you know, I do see that. I do see that the full frame sometimes does produce a little bit better colors than the Micro Four Thirds, but that's just because it's letting more light in than the Micro Four Thirds. So they could be on the same setting, it's just the full frame will let more light in. But either way, to the naked eye, you're not going to be able to tell the difference. And when people see my work and I tell them that I shoot with a Micro Four Thirds, they're stunned because I'm getting such high quality results. You would think that I'm using a full frame camera. So at the end of the day, it all comes down to what your priority is, what you're willing to sacrifice on one versus the other, and kind of what type of photography you're doing. Like I said, I shoot up close portraits on a professional level, and I do it all with a Micro Four Thirds, and you would never even be able to tell. The S5 really impressed me, and it's definitely an added addition. I absolutely love it, but I also love my Micro Four Thirds. So do with this information what you will. You know, at the end of the day, like I said, it is your preference as to what you're looking for, what suits your needs. So hopefully this video helped you out a little bit. And like I said, if you subscribe to my channel and you like this video, you'll see more updates on all the Lumix gear that I've got coming. You'll see more updates on the S5. But yeah, hopefully you stick around and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you want me to review, what you want me to go over, because that really helps me structure my videos and gives me ideas. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I did explaining to you, and I'll see you next time.